Now I am. Okay. All right. So the thing that I do every class is I go into my root directory where I'm going to be storing all of my projects for this semester. So if you have a specific location on your machine where you want to store your files for this class, just make sure that you change your directory into there and create, you don't have to create a new folder because Express will do that for us. So I store mine under Documents, Georgian College, Monday, and I will end up creating a new folder called Week 4. Is this Week 4 already? Is it Week 3? Yes, but it's the week 4 classes. Okay, crazy. Time goes by so quick. Okay. So in order to install our Express generator globally, and for those of you, please make sure that you use Express generator. If you just install Express, it won't work. So we can just copy the command that's up at the top here, or you can also do it here and add the -G flag for global. But if you just copy under installation, if you go to NPM's website, or just copy what I'm putting on the board. So npm install -G. Sorry, one sec, we just lost the laptop. There we go. Make sure that the recording is still the correct screen. Still going, cool. Okay, sorry about that. So we type in npm install -G express-generator. So the Express generator is going to scaffold out our project with a pretty typical way of writing a MVC application. It's not just like a node application, but this is a common way of structuring your application for any MVC application. Does anyone here remember what MVC stands for? Show of hands. Okay, for those of you that don't know, MVC stands for Model View Controller, which is the way of splitting up our application into separate files. Is a good way of organizing our application. So once you install it onto your machine, it might take a little bit just for it to load if it's your first time doing so. But in order to create a new folder, we will type in express. We will type in --view equals pug. This is important because Express Generator has different views that you can use. The default one is Jade, which is not the one that we're going to be using in this class, but is often associated with Pug because Pug is basically Jade 2.0. There was an issue with the name of it. I guess there was some sort of company that was claiming ownership of the name Jade. So instead of trying to fight any sort of like legal battles in court, they just ended up renaming it Pug. But to this day, Express Generator still uses Jade by default. So once you type express with a space --view equals pug, the only other thing that you have to type in is what the name of your folder is going to be. So in this case, I'm going to call it Week 4. You can name it whatever you want. If you've already created a folder and you're in that folder, instead of using the name of the folder, you can just use a period, and that will use your current directory. But in this case, I'm going to be using Week 4. So I hit enter, and it's pretty quick, depending on your machine. And you'll see that it generates these files and folders. So if this is your first time running it, it gives you some very clear indication of what's going on. So it said that it created all of these files and folders. Then it tells you to change your directory. So by default, when you use the Express generator, it does not put you into that directory that you just created. So you will have to cd into it. So I type in cd week 04, and if I type in ls, it'll show me my files that are in that folder. If you're on Windows, using command prompt, typing in ls will not work. But if you're on a Mac or Unix-based operating system, it will. So in order to install our dependencies, we will type in npm install like we have in the past. If we don't put anything after npm install, it will install everything in our package.json file, which we will look at in a second. So we'll get some messages about stuff that was installed. If there's any sort of issues, like any sort of security issues, yep.
It shows like the system cannot find the path specified.
What do you mean when you give it?
Just after.
Oh, you created a called pub. So I think you might have done it. Yeah, you did dash dash view space equals pub. It should just be dash dash view equals pub. So, well, it looks like it didn't create it properly. No problem. Is anyone else having issues running Express Generator on their machine? Yep. Nope. Just use regular. So CMD. Yep. Yeah. Yep, no problem. Okay. So for myself, because I already have it set up as a command, I can do code, which will open up the folder into my code editor. If not, you can just drag it into, like, open it in whatever you use, like Sublime, Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio. It doesn't really matter. For this class, as I've said in the past, I always use Visual Studio Code just because it's my preference. I like the way that it works. It's pretty quick. It has a lot of plugins for it, and it's not as large of an application as just Visual Studio by itself. But once you open up the folder that we just created, as I mentioned, you'll be greeted with a couple different folders that it automatically creates for us. And we'll go over them in a second. But the first thing that we mentioned in the first week, or not the first, technically last week, was the package JSON file. So the package JSON file, when we create it, last week we ended up using npm init. When we use the Express generator, it automatically creates it for us. So we didn't have to put in the name or any version and stuff like that. And you'll notice that we have a default script of start. So we can just type in npm start into our terminal, and after we've installed, making sure that we have everything, our application will already be working. But it does automatically install some dependencies for us. So we get a package called debug, package called express, HTTP errors, Morgan, pug, and at the top is cookie parser. So, of course, last week we used Express already, so we know that this is for creating our server. A couple of the other ones that we won't go into too much, but they're pretty straightforward. Cookie parser, it parses cookies. That's what it does by its name. So if we're doing any sort of cookie authentication or anything with cookies, it will automatically parse it for us so that we don't have to set up any sort of logic for that. Debug is used for just doing debugging, logging. You'll see when we start our server that it will do some information for us. HTTP errors, this is for handling HTTP errors. Go figure by the name. Morgan, this is a different one. This is a logging library, so that way we can set up different log levels. For anyone, well, actually, one of the easiest way to know, to look at different log levels is if you open your inspect element, go into your console, you'll see on the left side that we have errors, we have warnings, and we have no info. So I can type in console.error, and say test, and we have an error message right here. I could also do the exact same thing with warn, and it will give us a warning. I can do .info, and it gives us an info. I can do .debug, and it gives us a verbose one. So effectively what Morgan does is it gives us a lot of this in an application so that way when we end up pushing this into a production environment, or basically someone that's using your website, we only want to log maybe what is an error and what's a warning. But we don't need any sort of like info logging, any debug logging, because we only need that when we're running it on our machine. So that's what that does. And then Pug is going to be our templating engine, which, as I mentioned, is kind of similar to using like PHP or using the Razor syntax in ASP.NET. There's tons of different template engines that are out there. In this case, we're just going to be using Pug. So, okay, so that's our package JSON. Other than that, the two main things that our application is going to run off of is under bin, there's a www file. So this is where the server is created. So we have our debug package here. We're using the HTTP library to create an HTTP server. There's a port that's generated right here, which you can see. It uses a function called normalize port, which what this does is it will check basically if that port's in use, as well as if our port in an environment variable is not set, it will default to 3000. We do something called app.set with a port. We then create a server, and this might be a little bit fast, but this is all generated for us. We don't have to worry about it. This is just the very bare bones of the server running. It's not our application, which is under app.js. I'll go into explaining that a little bit more. So we have our server that listens on a port. We have server.onError and server.onListening. These are events that end up getting fired. So if there's any sort of error, it basically will console log that error and give us some sort of useful message. And then on listening, which is when our server is actually listening on the port that we define, it will also console log, letting us know that it's listening on this port. So the main thing that our application is actually running on, where we define our user logic, is in app.js. And you can see at the very top of our file, we include it right here at the top of bin. So this is where a lot more of the magic happens, and is pretty similar to what we did in last week's class. So we're not going to focus too much on HTTP errors, but we include Express. So Express is right here. We have some routes here. So last week you had asked, how do we split this up into separate files rather than just having everything in one file? So this is very similar to last week where we require it in. We create a app variable that is an instance of our Express application. So Express is a function that we call, which returns our app. Then there's some other stuff that's in here that we didn't do last week. We have app.setViews, which what this does is it's telling our application where to find our dynamic HTML files. So we did that last week as well with our Pug files. And then we also set the view engine equal to Pug, so it knows what view engine we're using in our application. So the difference between app.set and app.use is, it is important, but it's not going to be a quiz. But app.set, what it does is it sets variables on our application. So it's kind of, if we had created an object, so let's say const app equals, and this is an object, it's setting key and values in our application. So you can think that it has view engine is equal to Pug. Our views is equal to the folder where our views are. And this is kind of what it's doing. It actually uses a different type of object that's in JavaScript called, can't remember if it's a map or a set, set mdn. I don't think it's actually a set, I believe it's a map. Yes. Okay. So here's an example. So it creates a map, and then it uses this set function to setting that key. So there's the key, and then the value, and you can set it to whatever you want. You can do it as a function, you can do it as an object, you can do it as a string. It's basically, you can think of it in terms, it's almost like a super object. But what's nice about it is the only way to mutate the values is purely by using the set function, and the only way that you can get the value is by using the get function and giving it that the value that, or the key that you're trying to use to access the value. But that's it. It's just setting application-wide configs on our application, so that way our application knows where to look for stuff. This stuff, most of it is not as important to know. We have our logger. This is just going to console log out when we hit a route. That's all it's for, is just for console logging where we're hitting and some meta information. We have express.json. This is so that way it can handle like JSON inside of our application. It also has URL encoded, extended false. This is just the default. There's tons of like explanations of what it's doing. As I hover over it, because this is a built-in middleware function in Express. It parses incoming requests with URL encoded payloads and is based on body parser. So body parser is another library. Honestly, most of this is not that important. It's just some of the default stuff that Express feels should be inside of an application. Cookie parser, as I said, it parses cookies. Express.static. This is where it will load our static files. So any of our JavaScript on the front end, any of our images, any of our CSS will all be served from the public folder, which you can see is right here. It then uses app.use, so that way on the index route, we're going to use our index router. It also uses app.use users, and it's going to use a users router. Lastly, this part right here is a catch-all. So this is a way that you can kind of write a catch-all to handle every sort of error. So typically when you go to a server and you go to a URL that doesn't exist, it doesn't just spin. And when we had written our applications before, if you tried to go to a route that you didn't create, our application would just continue to load. And the reason for this is it goes to our server tells us what's happening. But if it doesn't respond back, then the browser doesn't know what to do. So it's continually just waiting for an answer. So what this does is it catches a 404, which will mean that any sort of request that we do, whether it's a GET request, a POST request, a PATCH request, a DELETE request, etc., it will return back with a 404. So it's just telling the browser, look, dude, I don't know what you want to do with this, but this doesn't exist. So it uses next, and it creates a 404 error. Down here is our error handler. So this is the first time that we've seen a app.use with a function that has 4 parameters. And this is important, kind of. Usually you only set it up once. But before, we've used 2 different types. We've used a callback that has 2 parameters, which is request and response. And then we also tried to use one last week with 3 parameters, request, response, and next. But this one has 4. And the reason that this has 4 is any callback that has 4 parameters is used for handling errors, where the first one is the error object, and then it goes similar as before, request, response, and then next. So all this is doing is it grabs our message from the error and sets it into res.local's message. It also then takes the error and it just checks, are we in development? If we are, then we want to have that error. Otherwise, we just set it into an empty object so that we don't, what's pretty common is you do not give the user error to the user. You just only want that in development as you're testing. Otherwise, you want a nice error page that you give to your users. Then it responds back if there's a status code. By default, it'll be 500 instead of 404. And then we render our error page, which we'll show in a bit. So that's really it. The app is pretty basic, and some of you might be going, pretty basic, this doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Don't worry, by the end of the semester, this will make sense. There's just a lot that's going on that just tries to handle nice stuff for us. So, all right, so we have app.js. Now we have 3 folders besides our node modules that we haven't really looked at. We have a views folder, we have a routes folder, and then we have a public folder. I'm going to go over public first just because it is the most basic. As I mentioned, our public folder is for serving our images, JavaScript, and style sheets. The reason why this is in a public folder is we're not going to be doing any sort of dynamic stuff with our JavaScript. Like we write our JavaScript and then we serve it to the user. So it comes from the public folder. Same thing with our style sheets and images. We're not doing anything fancy with it. We don't want to dynamically serve images. We can kind of handle where that location is dynamically, but we're not doing any sort of image processing on the server. So we have an images folder, we have a JavaScripts folder, and we have a style sheets folder. You can rename these if you want to. Yep.
When you're on the server, is security different on these folders?
Not really. Like they're publicly accessible. Yeah. Yep. No, good question. So yeah, so it comes with a default style sheet. It does not come with a default JavaScript file, which in my opinion is too bad. I think it should. If you're going to create the folder, you might as well just create a file inside of it. But inside of our style sheet, it comes with two styles. It has a body style of padding 50 pixels with a default font, and then it has an anchor tag that just says it wants the colors of all anchor tags to be this blue. So that's it for public. As I said, it's pretty basic. This is just where you'll put any of your regular assets. So in some things you might have seen a folder called assets and other like MVC patterns. Maybe you've seen the term assets. Honestly, it doesn't really matter what the name of it is. Just by default with Express Generator, it's called public. So last week we went over what a route is. High level, basically a route, like other MVC things that you guys have used before, is the controller. This is where all of the logic on our server is going to exist. So we have a router.get on slash. This means on the index page, we want to handle the request. So we have our request, response, and next. And then we res.render index, and we give it a property of title express, which you'll see how it's used when we run our server in a second. And that's it. The three other things that are on here, we import express and create a router instance, and then we export that router instance. This is set up so that way we can import it into our app.js file. In the app.js file at the top, right here, you can see where we're importing our index router. We also do the same thing with users. So under users.js, under our routes, we import express, we create a router instance, we say on get, and here we have the index page again, and I'll go over in a quick sec. We respond back with a resource, and then we export it again. So the reason why we don't have any sort of collision here between our index route and our users route is inside of app.js, we have a prefix of where we want to use our users router. So users router will only be used on the /users route. And then from here, inside of our users.js, this is then the rest of it. So everything that is prefixed with users will then go in here. If you were to put /users for a URL, it would actually be /users/users. So we don't obviously want to repeat ourselves. So in this case, we just have it on the index of our users route. Does anyone have any questions so far? Feel free to ask a question if it doesn't make sense, because this is obviously the beginning of us using Express. So does anyone have any questions? Okay. So in both of our index file and our users file, as we did last week, we have a views folder. So under views, it comes with three different files. We have error.pug, we have index.pug, and we have layout.pug. So this is done a little bit different than what we have done in last week's class, where everything was done in index. What we have here that start with layout is we have our basic layout structure of an HTML document. We have our doc type HTML, we have an HTML tag, a head tag, title, link, body, and then we have this different thing that's called block content. Does anyone want to take a guess at what block content is? Kinda, yeah. Now, what's different about this is I can actually throw in as many blocks as I want. So I could do block foo, block bar, block baz. What's different about Pug compared to other templating languages that I've used is not that other templating languages can't have multiple blocks, but I find that the way that it breaks it up is very useful. So in most applications, you kind of have the same resources that are on every single page. But let's say that you are building a portfolio, which might be assignment 1. Most people on a contact form or on a contact page will have like a map that says, where that business is or maybe where that person lives. And in order to load that map, you need some additional JavaScript. Typically, people will use Google Maps, so you have to load some content from Google. So what people can do is have a block scripts, and then they can put stuff into this that will be loaded on that page specifically, rather than making them have to load that JavaScript on every page. But what's nice about these is we can create as many blocks as we want, or for those of you that prefer, as few of blocks as possible. So we don't want to overcomplicate it. I'm just showing you that block content itself is not something special. It's just the keyword of block.
Does this only exist in this file? Blocks.
So blocks can exist in any file. So, but what is common is we have our layout that every page is going to look like. So what's pretty common is you have like a footer and a header that is the same in everything.
So if I go to ASP.NET MVC,
Mhm.
this is the same as the default layout template.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's...
Does it require encode type at all? How does it handle encode type?
What do you mean?
Languages, encoding type for the lang attribute for HTML.
Oh, so you can put in the lang attribute.
You can.
Yeah, so you can do like lang equals en.
It's optional.
Yeah, it's optional.
Okay.
For most things that we're doing, most people will, the browser typically will take what your language is to be assumed to be the default. Obviously, we're not writing sites in multiple languages, so we don't even have to worry about that. Thank God, although I'm having to do that at work. Or I'm not doing it at work. Yeah. Right now, we are doing a site that everything has been in English before, and now our next site is going to be in Japanese. So obviously, two completely different languages. I am not Japanese by any sense. I don't know Japanese. So we're assuming that all the words are correct that we've been given by a translator. So, okay. So we have our block content. So this is used in our index file. So what you've seen before in like ASP.NET is you have your main, or not your main view, but you have your view that's being used on that page, and it extends from another layout. Is that the terminology that it's used, is extending? So we have exactly the same thing here. In our index.pug file, we extend from our layout, and then we also specify our block content. So this is a match to this layout right here. So we have our block content here, and inside of index.pug, what we're saying is inside of our block content, this is what I want to put inside of it. So if I run the application first, let's see, so npm start, and I'm actually, hold on, before I do that, I'm going to cancel this. I'm going to install NodeMon so that way as I save changes, the server will automatically restart. So that way I don't have to constantly kill Node. So I'm going to do save dev NodeMon, as we covered last week. We'll wait for this to install. Okay, so there we go. So just to add my dev command so that way I don't have to do this, unlike before where we did nodemon on server.js, you'll see that we're running node against, we're running node against the bin file. So we'll just copy exactly what is above right here, and we'll change it instead of being node to nodemon. So we're running nodemon against that bin file This is what is known as the entry of our application. So this is where the starting point of our application is. The reason that we know that is inside of here, well, we don't know this right away, but there is nothing that is importing our www file. Our app.js is imported into here, so we're not running it against app. We're actually running it against www. So okay, save that, run in my terminal. So I'll type in npm run dev to run that new script that I did. Remember, you can think of a script kind of like a shortcut for your programming. It's a way of taking a command that you will constantly run and just make it easier for access. So okay, so if I open up localhost to 3000, I get an error. That's my bad. Oh, of course. Okay. 1 second. So this is one thing that is good to know is when you are using Pug, when you are using Pug, it expects you to use one type of syntax or one type of indentation, either tabs or spaces, but not both. So if for some reason you start to get this error message, which is right here, you can use tabs or spaces, but not both. That's a pretty good error message to let you know. What I do is inside of Visual Studio Code, it has a replace feature. So if you're on Mac, it's Command-Shift-P, and if you're on Windows, I believe it's Windows-Shift-P. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you can try different combinations on your keyboard until it works. And then if you just type in tabs or spaces, your preference, I don't care, there's a convert indentation to tabs, so that way we're all consistent, and then you can save the file. So now I run it, and it's working correctly. So this is 100% zoomed in. We have our Express, welcome to Express. So what's happening here? So inside of our index.js, remember, Control-Shift-P, thank you. So if you hit Control-Shift-P if you're on a Windows, it will open up a little prompt at the top. You can just type in convert tabs to spaces or convert indentation to tabs or convert indentation to spaces. Again, your preference doesn't really matter. Just make sure if you get this error that you choose one or the other. So, all right, I have my block content, I have my index.pug, but first let's start with index.js. So again, index.js is used on the index of our application. So right here, it does res.render index, and then it passes a object with a title of express. So I can set this to hello world and save, and when I refresh, I get hello world, welcome to hello world. So this is a variable that is being passed into my index.pug file. So index.pug is passing a variable to index.pug in order to render. So index.js, you kind of get how that's going, but we can do some more after the fact. So inside of index.pug, we're extending from layout. And what that does is it basically says everything that's in this file, I want to render, and then I want to insert stuff into block content because it's right here. So inside of that block, I want to insert an h1 that's value is title. And then we have a paragraph tag where we say welcome to title. So these are two different ways that you can render a variable inside of your view. You can use the equals tag, which will prevent you from using any other text on that line, or we can inject it with this with the number sign and then the opening and closing brace in order to just inject a variable in that string. The other thing that you can also do is, like I said, in between this, I believe is any valid JavaScript. So I could do 1 plus 3, and we get 4. So any sort of JavaScript, because at the end of the day, Pug is being compiled through JavaScript, that's how it ends up working. So any sort of valid JavaScript is able to be done in there. So we have our H1 title and we have our paragraph title. So there are some things that we can do to make our lives a little bit, not necessarily easier, but there's different ways that we can use a block. So inside of our block, we could have a H1 that by default says you have not overridden the block content. So you'll see right here I have this H1, and I've kind of spoiled the punchline of what's going to happen here. But this block content will override anything that is in here. So if I refresh right now, you'll see nothing. It still says hello world, welcome to hello world. However, if I were to get rid of this content, just going to cut it, save, and I refresh, you have not overridden the block content. Missed a T, I guess. So I haven't overridden the block content. So what's nice in here is you can have basically a default, almost like a default variable of what your content is, or what your block is going to be. In this case, it's called the content. So if I paste that back in, save, refresh, it overrides the block content. So there are some other things that we can also do with blocks, which you can see by going to the documentation. There's pugjs.org, or you could just type in pug, probably pug node into Google, which might be the easiest thing to remember. Yeah, for me it's at the top. I know Google changes your search results based off of what you do, but at the top is pug for me. So where inheritance. So personally, I find Pug is makes it a little bit harder to navigate their documentation than others. But what we're looking at is inheritance. So extending and blocks, which is basically the basic of what our application is doing right now. So Pug supports template inheritance. Template inheritance works via the block and extends keywords. So in a template, a block is simply a block of Pug that a child template may replace. This process is recursive. So what this means is if you have a layout.pug file, you have index.pug that extends off of layout, you can then create another pug file that extends off of index and then override that block again. So what's nice, kinda, is that you can do as much overriding as you want. The other thing is, if I scroll down, skipping over some of this, blocks also have the ability to append and prepend. So as I had mentioned before, that say you have the example of I have a script that needs to be run on every page, but I have a script that has to be run on one page. So what I can do is I can actually append to the script's block in order to add my new script without overriding anything that was there before. So I'll show you right here. So if I do block append content, I will have my you have not overridden at the top, and then my content is below it. If I do the opposite by using prepend, it will take my content that's right here and put it before anything that is already there. So if I use prepend, refresh, it's now at the top. So hopefully you can see why this is kind of useful, because you can actually make some pretty complex appending and prepending if you chose to do so. So an example that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a prepend.pug file. And what prepend is going to do is it's going to extend off of our index.pug file. So in this case, you don't actually have to put .pug. You can just say index. Then I have my block content, and I want to prepend to the content. So I'm just going to put an H3 that says this is prepended, and that's it. I'm going to create another view that is called append.pug. And I'm just going to copy what's inside prepend, but I'm going to just call it append instead. So block append, say this is appended, save that. And if I open up my index, I'm going to create two different routes. I'm going to create /append, I'm going to create /prepend, and then I'm going to render both of those files. So if I copy this, I create /prepend and /append, and I'm going to load the prepend file and the append file. So refresh my application, it's still working. I type in /prepend, and you'll notice that my content that is in index.ht or in the index.pug is still prepended, and then more stuff is prepended on top of that. So I can continually, over and over again, prepend more and more to this. I believe this is where it gets a little bit weird. I can actually copy this numerous times, and it should append multiple times. So if I go to append, you can see that that's appended multiple times. So, yes. Yeah. So if I go A, B, C, and D, refresh, A, B, C, D. Do you know why? It's because JavaScript's sequential. So first code gets run, then it goes to the next block, runs that code, goes to the third block, runs that code, so on and so forth. So depending on the order in which you put it, if I wanted to, I could change the order by putting this up to the top and doing C, D, A, B. And if I refresh, it now goes C, D, A, B. But I can also do, maybe on this one, I want to prepend, and this one I want to prepend, so the order of this is going to be a little wacky. So I can do AC, hello world, welcome to hello world, you've not overridden, DB. So honestly, it's not very common that you will do a lot of prepending and appending. Typically what will happen is you will set up your blocks of what you're going to want to override with, and then you will override from there. This is just an example of showing you that you can continually do appending and prepending. The other thing is if I don't put anything, as you saw, because it goes by first order, if I don't put append or prepend, it will just replace. So at the very end of this, of append, it will just have an H3 that says B. So it's a pretty simple rule. You think first come, first serve, and whatever the last thing that was said is what will end up happening. So if it replaces everything, it's going to replace everything as the last step. So again, this is not a common way of writing your files. So I'm just going to delete, or if you want to, I'll just leave these in just because they're an example of stuff happening. So we'll save that. We have our prepending. Okay. So that's pretty much the core basics of writing a Node application. I mean, like, really, this isn't just the end of the class. It would be nice if it was just 4 weeks. Well, technically 3 weeks. But honestly, writing applications, I say it's not hard. It's just usually time consuming. Like writing, especially just writing an MVC application in Node, is just taking these concepts of what we're using and re-implementing them over and over again. If you wanted to do some more complex stuff, obviously, like I'd say the only other thing outside of this is working with a database. That's the only mystery that we haven't done, is we don't have any persisting. But really, when we have our applications, it's just taking data that we have and being able to manipulate it by either like partially prepending or appending different stuff. Sometimes we loop, sometimes we just do like counting, but that's pretty much it. If I go under Pug, there's a lot of really good language references for you. big thing that's always good to know in every single language, in my opinion, is obviously commenting. Pug has two different ways of commenting, just like unfortunately almost everything. But the comments that are in Pug, you can see are a little bit different. So if we do our traditional // comment, what this actually does is it gets converted into an HTML comment. So that way we can just write our comments a little bit cleaner, but it does this, you know, less than exclamation mark, dash, dash, just use some paragraphs, dash, dash, greater than. So this gets converted into an HTML comment. If we want to do a full comment where it does not show up in the source of our HTML, we use a // dash. So the same as a regular comment, just with a dash after, and the markup will not include the comment in our source. It also has the ability to do block comments. So notice here that we're still using // dash. And what we do is everything has to be tabbed in from it. Because Pug is white space sensitive, it will only know that these comments are inside of, it will only know that this text is inside the comment if it is tabbed in. If it's not tabbed in, then it doesn't really know that it belongs. And then same thing with a regular HTML comment, it just has to be tabbed in. We also have conditional comments, which conditional comments are kind of an older thing for supporting older browsers. Mostly we won't be using this, but you can just use regular HTML here for doing your comments. And that's it for comments. So what I would say starts to make more complex layouts is when we start doing conditionals. As we know, conditionals pretty, again, in its basics is basic. It's just if Boolean condition. But we can start to get some complex layouts when we start to do so with our layouts, usually like in a nav. So one example of doing some conditional logic on our HTML is if you're logged into a site, you don't need to display the page to log in. You don't have to do that. Same thing if you're not logged in, you don't need to display the nav link to log out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Bootstrap, and I am going to set up Bootstrap for our site. In fact, I'm going to show you one other site that is a little bit easier to use if you're not as familiar with Pug. The other site is going to be called HTML2Jade. So as I mentioned before, Jade and Pug are pretty much the same, but what this does is it allows you to paste HTML code in, and it will give you the Jade equivalent or Pug equivalent, as well as the inverse. So if I change text on the left, let's just throw an H1 right here, it throws an H1. And if I do the opposite, if I start editing text on the right-hand side, it will modify it on the left. So it's a live editor both ways. It converts Pug into HTML and HTML into Pug. Why am I showing you this, though? Why, you might be asking. Is, of course, Bootstrap gives a lot of documentation on how to implement Bootstrap into your application. But trying to sometimes get stuff working is not exactly the easiest, especially when you're learning a new syntax and they don't give you examples. So what you can just do is copy the example in here. They have their CSS. I'm going to paste it into HTML2Jade, and on the right-hand side, it will give me the Pug equivalent to paste into the application. So I'm just going to set up in my layout.pug. I'm going to be setting up Bootstrap so that way I can use it in our application. So I'm going to comment out the style sheet that comes by default. We don't need it. In fact, we don't want it. And I'm also going to take the JavaScript that they provide at the bottom. So I'm going to also paste that in to HTML2Pug, and I'm going to copy it over. So I want my scripts at the bottom of my page, right here. So quickly to explain this, any sort of attributes that we put on our tags, we end up doing in between parentheses, kind of like it's a function. So we name it, in this case we have a link with a rel, so rel equals style sheet. We have an href property. This is comma separated, but fun fact, you don't actually have to put the commas. You can just do it without. I like to put the commas because I find it a little bit easier to read. Then it has the integrity and the cross origin. And we have the same thing for the scripts down here. So if I save this and refresh just the index page, we have our hello world. And we can test this by going into index.pug. I'm just going to close all the files. So our index.pug, and I'm going to make it not prepend anymore. I'm going to put it in a card. So a card is a class that is done by Bootstrap, so that you can, it's usually my go-to of seeing that we're in, actually I'm going to put in a jumbo, I think it's jumbo dashtron. Hold on, maybe not. Yeah, I think you're right, it is. Yep, just one word. So there we go. So we can see that we have Bootstrap correctly installed because the Jumbotron is loading, so that's a pretty good indicator that it's working. But when we come back from the break, which we will be doing right now, we're going to be going over some more of the syntax of Pug and working with doing some conditional logic, as well as getting familiar with the syntax of Pug. So if you guys want to be back here at 7:15, we will continue doing this then. Meanwhile, if you need to approach me, I'll be up at the front, or I can help with any sort of questions if your code is not working on your machine. I don't see that changing.
No.
Okay, so I'm going to turn the lights off again. Okay, so just before the break, we implemented Bootstrap into our site. I've also pushed the code up to GitHub, so if you need to access any of the code, you can go under Weekly Learning Week 4, and there is a link to my GitHub code. Guys at the back, can I get you to quiet down, please? So you can either go onto GitHub in order to access the code with just going to my name or going on Weekly Learning to access it. So I'm going to try to slow down just a little bit. I know that this is new to probably the majority of you, so I'm going to try to slow it down just a bit so that way everyone is following along. If for some reason I'm still going too fast, please don't be shy to just ask me to slow down. I don't take any offense to it. Obviously, I have a lot more experience with this than you guys do. So it's hard for me to put myself into the mindset of someone that's more like a beginner at this, so I do apologize for that. This kind of stuff is pretty easy to me. I could do this most likely with like my eyes blindfolded, so long as I hit the right keys on the keyboard. But okay, so what I said before the break that I was going to do is I was going to implement a nav bar and then start to change that nav bar based off of some state. So what I'm going to do is inside of my layout.pug file, I'm going to put in a nav bar. And the reason why I would put this inside of a layout is typically you have the same nav bar site-wide. It doesn't matter if you're on the contact page, it doesn't matter if you're on the about page. Typically we have the same nav bar. So if you open up your browser and go to Bootstrap, and you go to examples, or maybe not examples, I'll go to documentation, I can search navbar. So under components is navbar, and you can scroll down to where they have the source code. And you can just copy it right here. So you can click copy, and then we'll paste it into our HTML to Jade. Again, I'm not gonna make you type out this giant navbar so that way you can learn the pug syntax. You're welcome to do that in your own time, but I will try to make sure that you understand the syntax. So we'll go over this because this is a good example of a large amount of HTML that we'll be converting into pug. So if I paste this into the HTML side, I get the output. So I'm going to quickly explain this before I copy. So I've had not complaints because they don't necessarily like pug. What I usually find is that people complain about pug because they don't understand it at first. The one thing that kind of sucks about HTML, in my opinion, is that it's very verbose. And that's one of the complaints of why people don't typically use XML anymore and why they more prefer JSON. So in this example, we have a fair amount of lines on the left side for our HTML. So every single element has an opening tag and we have a closing tag. But the benefit of using pug is that you don't have to have that closing tag because everything that is considered a child is just indented into its parent. So you can see here that we have our nav, we have a class of navbar, we have a class of navbar extend large, we also have navbar light and BG light, so background light. So instead of specifying class, what we have the alternative in pug is we have a dot syntax. So that dot syntax should look pretty familiar. For anyone that's done CSS before, is a dot represents a class in CSS. And that's how we do our classes in pug, is we can just use a dot on the element instead of saying, you know, class equals this, that, the other thing. Now that is perfectly valid syntax, especially if you need to do some sort of dynamic classes. But for all case and purposes, typically our classes are pretty static, unless if we change it in JavaScript. So we have our nav, we have navbar, .navbar expand large, .navbar light, and .bg light. So you can see we've saved some characters, not that big of a deal. but something that is maybe a little bit easier to understand. And I'm going to also be honest, some of the syntax is kind of ugly as well. Like this right here is slightly confusing, especially if you compare it to this one. But what we have here is we have our UL with a class of navbar nav and mr auto, which is margin right auto. And it uses li with a nav item active. That li inside has an anchor that hrefs to just the pound symbol, so that means that it would just go to the top of our browser. Then it uses this pipe. So what pipe does is it is a way of saying this is in the parent one. But the reason why we have to use the pipe is we don't have an HTML tag called home. So we use the pipe operator to just basically say this is just going to be raw text that follows, but it goes in the previous one. If anyone's kind of familiar with Linux, when you pipe stuff, it's a little bit similar, not exactly the same, but we use the pipe syntax of saying this belongs to the previous tag. We then also have a span SR only, and then we have the current. So there's a lot here, and what's actually really nice in Pug is we can simplify this to make it a lot easier on ourselves. So I'm going to copy this, and I actually previously said I was going to use layout.pug. I'm actually going to create what's called a partial. So you might be familiar with partials in PHP or in ASP.NET. It's basically a way of abstracting part of the markup into a partial file that we can include later on. So I'm going to create a folder called partials, and I'm going to put our nav.pug inside of it. So we have a partials folder underneath our views, and I'm going to put nav.pug inside of it and paste our navbar. So the other thing that stands out more when I paste it into this editor is you can see the purple with the pound symbol, or the number sign, or the hashtag, whatever you want to call it. And this is an ID. And you also can see one other thing, is that it doesn't have a tag in front of it. Does anyone want to guess why it doesn't have a tag? Any guess. It doesn't really matter. You can be wrong. Don't be shy. So the pound symbol is for an ID. Yes, you're correct. But why doesn't it have any like UL or div or li in front of it? That's more what I'm asking. Right here. You can see there's no tag. So the reason for this, and you've probably seen in Bootstrap before, is the div tag is probably one of the most used tags in HTML. It's probably arguably the most overused tag or misused tag, but it is still the most used tag. So what you can do is if you don't specify which type of element that you're doing, it actually defaults to using a div. So you don't even have to put div like that. You can actually just leave it blank and just put in your ID and then your classes.
Does it know where the div would close then?
Yes, because everything is tabbed inside of it.
Okay.
So basically everything that's down here is all inside of this div. So if I wanted something not inside of the div, I could take this, so this is all on the same, and I could untab it so that way it lines up with it. And if it lines up, then that means that it is equal and not inside of it. It's not a child. So I'm just going to convert this into tabs because I have my editor set up for tabs. Okay, so I have my nav, and now if I want to include this into my layout, I actually use that same word. I use the word include. So the nav is usually always at the top of an application. So I use include, and then I give it a string. So I can say dot slash, actually I believe I can just do it like this. So dot slash partials slash nav. And this will now go into, in the current directory, go to the partials folder, and include my nav. If I open up Google Chrome and go into our application, It looks like I'm not running it, so that might help. So npm run dev. All right, now it's running. Refresh. And now I have my nav bar at the top. So if I zoom out, there we go. So I have the brand, I have the home link, another link, a drop down, a disabled link, a search bar, and search. So I'm going to remove most of this because we're not going to be doing anything with it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a fake login and register, and then I'm just going to put a couple sample links. So in our nav.pug, I'm going to remove most of this because we don't need it. So pretty much this part, this is only the code for the drop down and the disabled link. And I'm just going to have example 1, and I'm going to paste it again as example 2. Lastly, I'm going to create a UL right here, and that UL is going to have margin left dash auto, and I'm going to put a li.nav item. Actually, I'll just copy up here and just make it say login, and then I'm going to get rid of the input and the button that's there, just because we're not doing any sort of form stuff. So in here we have our home page, which I'm just going to actually link to slash, because that would be our home. And then our example 1 and example 2 are not going to link anywhere, and our login page is not going to link anywhere, for now anyway. Yes?
Can you repeat the steps that you made on layout.pug?
Yes, so in layout.pug, all I did was I included the partials nav. And again, it's just looking in that partials folder that I created right here under views, and then it's grabbing the nav.pug file. So if it makes it a little bit easier, you can just put nav.pug, so that way you know it's grabbing that pug file, but it is not mandatory to include .pug as the extension. So is it okay if I just go to Chrome, just to show it off? So if I go to Chrome, refresh, I have a login right here, and I have my example 1 and 2, although this does have a list style, so I'm just going to remove that with navbar nav. There we go. So now it looks proper. So I have login, I have example 2, and example 1. So in order to change that, well actually, hold on. Yeah, so I'll go over this. Sorry. So one thing that Pug has that is quite beneficial is it has the ability to do what is called a mix-in. Does anyone know what a mix-in is? Just show of hands if you, has anyone heard the term mix-in before? So what is an ugly way to do this, and I'm just going to quickly do this, so if you just want to follow along, you don't have to copy this to your computer. I'm going to create a file called navlink.pug. And what this navlink is going to do is it's only going to have a li with nav item and then an anchor with navlink. So if I wanted to include it, I could do include, say slash, and then navlink, and I could comment both of these out. So if I include the navlink twice, you'll see that I have example 1 twice. Now if I want to change it, I have to do something different. I have to say, I could create a variable and say var link name equals example 1, and then down below I could say var link name equals example 2, and then inside of our navlink I could then render navlink. And that one didn't work because it's not passing it. Okay. Well, anyway, part of what I'm trying to show off is this is not a good way to do something. So in Pug, what we can do is we can create a mix-in. And what that mix-in is you can think of it like a function, that you can give it parameters and then it will return you Pug markup. So I'm just going to delete the nav link. And at the top of my nav, it can be anywhere, but I'm going to put it at the top. I'm going to create a mixin called navlink. And what that does is it returns an li nav item with an anchor with navlink. So I'm actually just going to remove that for now and just say text. So right now, if I wanted to call this navlink, I declare it with a mixin, and in order to call it, I use the plus syntax, which is probably a little strange, but use plus navlink and then call it like a function. So I can put that in twice and refresh, and we still get nothing. But you'll see if I use inspect element that we have our navlink right here. We're just not displaying any text inside of it. So like any regular function, you can give it parameters. So in this case, I'm going to give it a string that says example1. And then this one is going to get example2. So now because I'm passing a parameter, it comes into here as an argument. So now I'm receiving a value called text, and then I render out the text right here. So I can refresh. Oh, hold on, let me close that. So now I have example1 and example2. I could change this to being with a third navlink that says example3, refresh, and it's there.
But you probably have to pass in the actual URL as well.
Correct. So if I wanted to make it so that I can link to an actual page, I could give it a second argument if I want. So in this case, it's going to be another string, and it's going to be the location where I want. So just in this case, slash, and maybe we'll get rid of this home page up here. So we'll just get rid of this one, and we'll make this say home. Then secondly, we're going to want maybe an about page, and then a contact page. So we have home, about, and contact, and we're going to go to the slash about page. Then on the contact page, we want to go to slash contact. So right now in our navlink function, or in this case, it's actually a mixin, but you can think of it like a function. We're not using the location that we're passing to it. So we need to add a second argument called location. Actually, just doing, that looks weird. I feel like it shouldn't be highlighting that, but anyway. So now I can just do href equals location. So if I save that, go into Chrome, refresh, now I have home, about, and when I click home, we go to the home page. If I click about, we'll get an error because we don't have an about page. But you can see that up here it says about, and then contact, it also goes to the contact page, which is an error. So what if you don't pass it a location? So JavaScript gives you the ability to do a default value. So I can just do location equals pound symbol. And then down here, I have my contact, and I have my about page. So I don't want those to actually link anywhere because I don't want to set them up. I'm kind of lazy. But I still want to have the text there. So now if I go to the home page and I click about, it doesn't go anywhere. So I have that default value of location. Now, JavaScript can get pretty weird. You can do some really weird stuff. Instead of passing it just a comma separated, or passing it values separated by obviously a comma, I could pass it an object if I wanted. And I could say text equals about, and location is, I'm just going to use the actual pound symbol instead of doing default. And then up here, I can say options and use options.location. and options.text. So if I comment those out right now, I will only have about and location. So this is just to show you again that any form of JavaScript is totally valid. If I refresh this, I have the about page. So why is this important? So one thing that I've seen in the past, and honestly, I'll say this, there's no right way of doing programming. I'm sure you guys are probably fully aware of this by now. But what is important is readability. We always want, or not just readability, but maintainability. And usually the two correlate together. But if we want to be able to modify our application or have others modify our application, we want it to be as easy as possible. And if we had an application that had multiple and multiple routes, well, for one, it's probably not a good interface. But sometimes we want to abstract that out. So I'm actually going to go back to what I was using before, of just using slash, or just using it as strings. So I'll have text, comma, location. So we have this. So refresh should work, yep. But maybe we want to handle this in a different spot in our application. What might be a good idea is maybe to have an array of all of our valid routes. So we could say, I could create it right here if I wanted. So I could say var routes equals, and then I can create an array. So the first one is going to be home and slash. So this is, the first one is an array. The second one is also, it's just going to be an array of arrays. So the first one has home and the route. The second one only has the name. And then the third one also only has the name. Why am I doing it like this? Who here has seen or is familiar with the spread syntax in JavaScript? So you can spread both an array and you can also spread an object. And what this does is if I open up the console and let's say I create a function called sayABC. And what this does is it lets me accept the values A, B, and C, and it will console log A, console log B, and console log C. So okay, so I created a function called sayABC. If I wanted to use it, I call it by giving it A. In this case, I'm just going to switch it up just so you see the order. Give it C, and I'll give it B. And I call it, and right here in my info, I can see that I logged out ACB. So what I can also do, if I had an array, I'll show you this. So I create an array called example, and that's going to have A, B, and C. So okay, I've created an example. I wish it didn't always say undefined, but it does. So I can actually spread this array as arguments that I'm passing to it. So I can do say ABC and give it example. And it now logs out ABC. So this is kind of like a way of defining what you're going to pass to it, and then using the spread syntax will then pass the separate arguments individually rather than giving it an array and then looping over them in the template. So why did I just go through that? The reason is I have an array, so I'm going to use a for each. Or for those of you, if you don't know what a for each is, it's kind of similar to like a for loop. But in this case, they use it a little bit differently in Pug. So I can say for route in, is it for route? I believe it's in. So for route in routes, I now have a variable called route, and I can do a plus navlink and spread the route information. So if I comment this out, save that, refresh, That didn't work. Let's just see. Div equal div equals route. So let's just see if this spits out what we want. We'll just get rid of that. So it did not. So we have home, comma, slash. What is it not liking? I wonder if it's just my syntax. One sec, let me see this. I screw up syntax all the time. This is the issue with working in multiple programming languages at the same time. Sometimes it's hard to remember. So under the Pug.js documentation, again, down here they have iteration. So iteration, when you're iterating over something, each val in, am I using each in? Yeah, for, oh, I'm using for, that's why. So I have to say each. This is where I messed up. So each route, this should work now. So each route in routes. Still not liking that. Unexpected text on line 32. No, that's not right. Do. Maybe it just doesn't like the syntax. So route 0.
You had a space between the spread after the spread operator.
Did I?
Yeah. Or is that just the way you're...
That's just how it's doing it. Yeah. So route 0, route 1. No, so, oh, that's probably it. Ah, thank you. All right. It's actually, it was the semicolon. To quickly explain, so I have an array of 3 elements. I have this one right here, which is the home and slash. I have a second one, which is about, and then the third one is contact. So what this is doing is for each element, so in this case it'll be the first, second, and third, it's not iterating over the home and slash, it's actually iterating over each array that's there. So now I should be able to use ... route, refresh, there we go, okay. Thank you for catching that. So let that be a lesson. Don't use a semicolon in Pug, it does yell at you. I constantly forget that, and I'm used to throwing in a semicolon in regular JavaScript, but it's good to know. So if I wanted to add in now a 4th route, it's now really easy to do so. I can just add to this single array and do a 4th one called example. And now I can refresh, and example's there. It's really easy to now add new routes. The other thing is here's something that I'll say. It is not usually good practice to creating new variables inside of a view. The reason for this is, as I mentioned at the beginning of class, we have our app.js file. And what this is for is setting application level variables. So what I could do is I could create an application level variable for all of our routes. And I could define it there and then be able to access it inside of our layout, technically inside of our nav, which is used in our layout. But honestly, as I just said before, there's no good way of doing, there's no right way of doing programming. There might be better ways than others, but honestly, when it comes to what you're wanting to do, feel free to do whatever you want, as long as it works. That's kind of the important part. So I'm going to simplify this back to what I was doing, just using home and then slash, paste a couple. Should have maybe done it without that, but so about, contacts, and I'm just going to get rid of those. Save, and we're now back to where we were. So that's something that maybe it's not obvious right at the beginning, but JavaScript is very flexible. And where that benefit comes into is inside of our views, this also makes our views very flexible. So we can do kind of whatever we want as long as it's within the realm of JavaScript. So what I mentioned before was being able to dynamically show or hide something in our application. So what I'm going to do is right here, I have my login. I'm also going to put in a nav link for /login that goes to our login page. But obviously we don't have one. So I'm going to create a if statement that's just going to say login and log out. So we have login and log out. So using the same nav links that we were using before, right beside each other when I refresh. If I refresh, there we go. Login goes to the error page, log out, also error page, which we will set up in a second. We're not actually going to be logging in today, so don't worry about that. We're just going to be able to set something. So we have our login, and I'm going to create a if statement. So I can just do that inline. So I can say if is logged in. So if we're logged in, I want to display the log out. So this is kind of like any if statement that you've seen in other programming languages. And I can do an else statement. It says if I'm logged in, show the log out page. Otherwise, show the login page. And I'm also going to just do let's do an H6 of is logged in. So if I refresh this, we get nothing. I'm actually going to use is logged in.toString. Doesn't like that, so never mind. Okay, so we have login. And the reason that we have login is, hopefully as you know, there's two different ways that you can define something not being there. So JavaScript has two kind of things of emptiness. So there's the keyword undefined, and there's the keyword null. In JavaScript, null is explicit emptiness. So let's say you're writing an application where you say what your age is. So in most cases, you would typically think your age is going to be a positive integer. You could have 1, 2, 3, etc. But let's say someone, I don't know, you have an Instagram account, and you're registering an Instagram account the moment that your child is born, just because people are weird and they do stuff like that. So at that point, with your birthday, you would actually be 0 years old, which is totally valid. You can be 0 years old. However, if you wanted to have a default state, it's probably not a good idea to set that default to being 0. Because if you wanted to do, you repetitively loop until they give you valid input, maybe they just give you a string. So you want to loop until they give you a number. So starting with a number is not an option. That's where we'll use null. So we'll say age equals null, and while age is not a number, keep asking them for their age. However, undefined is a little bit different. When we declare a variable and don't give it a value, its default value is undefined. It's not null, which for most cases is relatively the same, but not older, but you can, for some reason, set the value of undefined equal to something. So you saw, don't know if this is 100% going to do what I think it's going to do, but we'll test. So you saw before when I said var temp equals 1, it then just console logged undefined. So something that I can do is I can say undefined actually equals 100. So now when I create a new var, it still says undefined. But I can say console log undefined, and that's undefined. Maybe, okay, it's probably using strict mode. Anyway, sorry. In previous versions, or depending on your browser, you can actually set what the value of undefined is, which is, to me, it's crazy. Undefined was not an actual protected keyword. So you can actually set its value and then do, let's see, var temp2 equals undefined. Maybe that one will actually do it. Console log temp2. No, okay, so it doesn't let you do it because probably of strict mode. Anyway, not the case. The reason is that value is the absence, or sorry, undefined is the absence of a value, whereas null is the explicit thing of saying that there is no value. So kind of a little bit different. The reason why I say that is right now is logged in is undefined. It has no value. So what it tries to do is it tries to convert undefined, or we could set null, into a Boolean. So you've seen me use before the triple equal syntax, and you probably used that in your previous JavaScript class. But what this does is it's used for strict type comparison. So if is logged in, it gets converted into a Boolean. So undefined and null both get converted into false. So in this case, this equates to if is logged in, it ends up being false. So it goes to the else and it goes to login. However, if we were to set is logged in to true, or what is called a truthy value, it would then end up showing our log out. So which page am I on right now? I'm on the login page. I'm going to go to the home page because we already have that set up. So in our routes, under index, I have our index page, and we're passing it type. Still says hello world, but I'm going to pass it a value of is logged in, and I'm going to pass it true. So now when I refresh, I'm now passing it the value of is logged in, and it now will display logged out. And you can see that I was console logging out the value of true. For some reason, here's something else that's kind of weird. If the value is true, it will console log it. If it's not, I believe it does not log it if it's undefined, but it will if it's false. There's honestly so many different rules where it does this. It's hard to keep track of all of it. Okay, so it does do false, but if it's undefined, then it won't do it. But you can see right now, is logged in is false, and it now says login. If I switch it to true, it says logout. So you've done this before in other classes, in your PHP and ASP classes, of being able to manipulate the view based off of if you're logged in or not, or some other value. But this is how we go about doing it in Node and with Pug. It's, to me, fairly straightforward because you end up passing these values. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to pass a value every single time. We don't want to pass the same values across the entire application. So I'm going to show you very quickly how we can go about passing a value to every single page. So in app.js, before we have any of these app.use middlewares, I'm going to set up my own middleware. So when I use app.use, we still get the request and response and next object. So again, request is what is coming from the user. This is, like their client information, their IP address, their browser, all that sort of information of what the client is sending to you. And honestly, we don't have to do anything with this. All we have to do is we want to modify the response that we're sending back, but we still want to hit our next routes. We don't want to actually respond back with something. We just want to modify part of the response. So what Express has is res.locals. So res.locals are variables that you can set that will be sent to every single view that you use. So I can use res.locals.is logged in equals true. And then I use next to call the next function that is able to be run. So I'm not setting is logged in every single route. So you can see that it's all missing here. But when I refresh, it's still true. And if I change it to being false, you'll see that it's now false. So this is a middleware function that is quite commonly set up for being able to check if someone is authenticated or not. Because most likely you're going to want to know on every single page if that user is logged in or not. So we will be going over middlewares more when we actually go over authentication in the following weeks. But this is just a good thing to know that we can set up logic that will be carried out on every single request. So let's see, 8 o'clock. We're going to do another 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to be going over Lab 2, which will be due on Sunday. And we're just going to be going over some of the stuff that is required for that. A lot of everything that actually is required for the lab we have already gone over. And in fact, there's not going to be any need to use Pug. You're more than welcome to use Pug, and in fact, it makes it a little bit easier to style what we're doing, but it is not mandatory in order to do it. So with that, if you want to be here at 10 after 8, I'll go over Lab 2, do a little couple examples with you, so that way you're hopefully not 100% in the dark, but again, mostly everything that we've been doing has been in class today. And then, yeah, we'll be done for the night. So I'm just going to pause the recording for now, and I'll be available for any questions if you have any right now. Yeah, we're about to be doing some VR stuff at work, VR and AR at Tiger Shark. Um, some things that I can't really talk about right now, but
If they're looking for any vinyl equipment, see online.
we already have all of ours because they had done stuff before. Actually, they had done a project with Pratt Homes that's almost the exact same of what this is, but they had built it in Unity instead of that was built in Unreal.
Nice.
So,
Cool.
less no that labs. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Okay. Yep. So, all right. So, lab 2 is going to be a simple, I put in quotes because, I mean, obviously my definition of simple is different than what your definition of simple is. But it's to build a simple calculator. So, the purpose of this lab is to kind of start getting more comfortable in the Node and NPM ecosystem. For this project, or sorry, not project, for this lab, you don't actually have to use the Express generator. You can use it because, like I said, it'll scaffold out the project for you, but it's not a requirement. You can just set up Express by yourself if you so want to. But the steps for this lab is to create a Node application called Lab 2. You can call it whatever you want, but just for all case and purpose, it's Lab 2. You'll initialize npm and create a package JSON via the wizard. You'll install Express module with npm, modify package JSON to use NodeMon to start your application. Again, not 100% of a requirement, but it's hard to test if you're not using NodeMon. 1 second. I'm sorry. Might be an important work message. Okay. Sorry, we were doing a lunch tonight. Okay. So after you modify your package JSON to use NodeMon, you'll create a server.js. Again, you can just use the Express generator. And you'll link Express, link to the Express and URL packages. Trying to follow what I think I'm just saying use like when you require in Express into require into the server. Okay, sorry. So you'll just require an Express into the server. You're then going to write a calculate function that parses the URL for 3 parameters, method, x, and y. The possible values for the method parameter are add, subtract, multiply, and divide. If the method value is anything else, then you are to show an error message. So you don't have to worry about anything else. And you're going to determine which math operation to run based off of the value of the method parameter. Then you will perform this math operation on the other 2 values, which are x and y, and you will display the full math operation and its result on the page in this format. So x, and then the method that was used as the query parameter, y equals, and then the result. So there's 4 example URLs. These are not the only ones, so please do not hard code returning 20, 12, 64, and 4, because I've had that and I will catch it. I'm not dumb. But a sample URL of the first one is, so you use localhost 3000, you give it a method of add, and then x is 16 and y is 14. And what this will do is output 16 plus 4 equals 20, because 16 and 4, when you add them together, is 20. Hopefully I'm not having to explain this, but I do sometimes get questions every time. So if I'm sounding like I'm explaining to you like an idiot, I'm not, but you might be. I don't know. We'll see. So localhost 3000, the next one, method is subtract. Again, the example, x is 16, y is 14. All of these are examples 16 and 4. So yeah. So 16 minus 4 is 12 is what will be displayed. When we use multiply, 16 times 4 is 64. And then when we divide, 16 divided by 4 is 4. Okay. So installing npm and why is that copied? Okay, so I'm just gonna get rid of that. Must have been when I was editing it before. Okay, to submit your lab, as I mentioned in the first couple weeks of class, every code submission in this class is done through GitHub. So please do not submit a zip file. Only submit a link to your GitHub repository. For this one, I'm gonna, I guess, add in here. Please make it so that your GitHub repository must be private. So GitHub, actually, as of, I believe it was the last semester, maybe it was the semester before, now allows you to have unlimited private repositories. So you're not going to have any sort of limits that you hit before you. I think you only used to be able to have 1 or 2, but now it's unlimited. So create a private GitHub repository, and then you will have to add me as a collaborator. So in the settings of your GitHub repository, add Naismith as a collaborator so I can mark. Excuse me, sorry. That's going to be awful on the recording. In the settings, please add me as a collaborator because otherwise, if you do not, I'm not able to mark it. And then the rubric is it's a pretty simple breakdown. You get 1 mark for the 4 endpoints working correctly. So if addition works, you get 1 mark. If subtraction works, you get 1 mark. Multiplication works, you get 1 mark. And division, you get 1 mark. Setting up Express correctly also gives you 1 mark. And cloud hosted is also 1 mark, but it is a bonus. I don't know why I didn't put that in properly. Oop, what did that just do? Apparently I just made a duplication. I don't want that. Okay. But if you get it cloud hosted, it is another bonus mark. I like to give out bonus marks just because I know not everyone in this room is as interested in this as possible. In the future, we are going to be doing cloud hosting for like assignment 1. It is mandatory as well as assignment 2. But this is a good opportunity in order to learn how to take our Node application and be able to put it on the web for someone else to access. So this, I promise, super, super easy. I know you're looking at me. What's the site? Heroku. So we'll be using a site called Heroku. I'm going to actually just very quickly show you the steps on video on how to get it cloud hosted. So this is a very easy way of getting 20% extra on this lab. So let me create a directory called lab2. And I'm going to use npm init. Let me zoom in the terminal so you can actually see it. Also, this file is not yet on Blackboard. I'll just be posting it just as soon as I'm done class, so you can still get it. And then also, as per usual, this assignment is due Sunday. So Sunday at 11:59 p.m. I can be like a little lenient if you like submit 2 minutes late. I'm not going to take off 10%. But within reason, I mean, I'd say anything for sure over half an hour, I'll take off 10%. So even if it's 12:30 a.m. in the morning, you lost 10%. The purpose of this is I don't want you guys to wait until the last minute and stay up all night working on a lab. It's due at midnight. That's it. Does anyone have any questions about Lab 2? It's roughly translate to being about 6 or 7%, somewhere in there. It ends up being like a decimal somewhere in between there. It just depends. I had mentioned, depending on the time constraints, we may be able to do Lab 4, but in other classes I haven't been able to, and I lost 2 days to the holiday. So we'll see if we're able to do a Lab 4. That's what kind of changes it, but it hovers in and around there. So I'm going to npm init my project, and I'm just going to use -y. This is a quick way of initializing your project. It just does all the defaults for you, so you don't have to worry about it. And I am going to create a server.js. So there's two things we haven't done in this class. We haven't cloud hosted, and we haven't really done a whole lot with query parameters. We've done route parameters before where we use request.params, but we've never done anything with query parameters. And I promise you, just like mostly everything else in here, it's pretty consistent on how to do it. Let me just go into it. Okay, so we have our server. So to initialize our server, we require in express. I'm going to create a port number, which is going to be 3000. We say const app equals express app.listen on port. And then on app.on, I believe it's just on listen. Say function that will console log listening on port 3000. So that's pretty much it. If I type in node server.js, cannot find, oh, I haven't installed Express. So I have to install Express, and as I'm doing that, I will also install NodeMon at the exact same time, so that way we can have live reloading as we're working. While that changes, I'm going to open up my package.json file, wait for it to modify so that way I don't change it twice. Should auto-update, there we go. And I'm going to add a script that's called start, because for some reason it doesn't come by default. It's going to be node on server.js, and then we're going to have dev, which is nodemon on server.js. And I'm just going to remove this test because we're not using it. It's not mandatory. So now if I type in npm run dev, apparently I'm already using it. So I'm just going to use kill all node, which is a handy command to know. And then now run it, and now it never ends up console logging it because I don't think I used the right on event. So right here, also just to let you know, this is not going to be pushed up because I'm not going to push up the code that allows you to just do the lab. If you need to, if you need to reference this, of course it'll be in the video, but this will encourage you to write your own code. Also, I guess maybe I didn't make, just in case if this is not clear, any labs are not to just be taking my code and resubmitting it. I know sometimes, like for one, obviously it's easier, but the purpose of these labs is so that way you can get a working knowledge of understanding how these applications work. And if you just end up taking the code that I write and submitting it, it's obviously not showing that you've learned anything if it's just my code. I know how to write it. I wrote it. But if you don't end up writing it, obviously you're not going to be learning, which is, again, the whole point of you guys being in college here. Sometimes I feel like a parent in class. I'm sorry if I come across that way. It's just, I mean, already teaching like 3 semesters, you come across some pretty weird stuff. So, okay, so we're listening on port 3000. If I refresh, we should just get, yeah, okay. That's exactly what I want. We get an error, which is good. So I'm going to do 2 things. So after listening, I'm going to say app.get. And this is just going to be on the index. And we're going to use our request and response. Because there's not going to be any other routes and we don't really care much about error messages, at least right now. Again, remember it is a requirement if you're not using a proper method. But right now, I don't care about an error. So I just have my request and response. So before we've used request.params in order to get params that are in here. So for example, username would be request.params.username. But we're not using URL parameters. We're just using query parameters, which means that we end up, wait for it, we changed it to query. That's really all that we do. So in order to get the method, we use request.query.method. So if I save that, I open Google Chrome, and I type in method equals add. I still get an error because I'm not responding back with anything, so let me do that. And I'm just going to respond back with the method that we're using, just so it's easier. So add, subtract, multiply, divide, and method junk. Obviously, this is not a valid one, but we can just kind of type whatever junk that we want in the method, and right now it's just going to send it back. So there's a couple things that we can do. We can say, I'm going to create an array and do this. So the array is add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So the reason why I create an array is these are the values that we are going to accept. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to check if it includes the request.query.method. So right now I'm not assigning this to anything. So I'm going to create a const is valid method equals this array dot includes request query method. You can also abstract this out if you want and just say create a variable called const valid methods equals our array that's right here. And if I move this up and say if it includes our method. So we're just kind of like cleaning up our code right here. So we're going to say get the method from query params, check if the method is in our array of allowed methods, return if it's valid. So now I'm just going to return true or false. So this is false, but if I do add, it's true. So now I can see what is allowed and what is not allowed. So has anyone here heard of the term returning early? And no, it doesn't mean you go to the store and you come back 15 minutes earlier than you thought you would. In programming, it's basically if you have a function that does one thing but it requires something else, you check if that function has been given what it wants. So let's say you have a function that requires x and y to be a number. And if you give it letters, or if you give it a string instead of a number, and you check it, if you say, if x and y are not numbers, then I want to return with an error message before I do any other code, because I don't want to execute anything else. So what I can do is I can say if not is valid method, then I want to return res.send, please use a valid method type, and we can say add, actually I'm just going to use, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to use the backtick for string interpolation, use the valid methods, and then use valid methods.toString. So please use a valid method type, valid methods toString. So right now it responds true, but if I type in random text, it says please use a valid response. So now I've handled that use case because now I want to execute code when it is valid. Do you have a question? Nope? Okay. Sorry, you were just holding your hand and I thought you might have one. No worries. So, okay. So I've returned early. I'm also going to put curly braces around this just so it's a little more obvious. So return early if it's not a valid number. Okay. So that's pretty easy. The other thing that we should probably also do is make sure that x and y are also numbers. So I'm going to do const x equals parse int request.query.x and const y equals parse int request.query.y. And then I'm going to do another if statement of returning early. So if is not a number, this is a function that is in JavaScript of testing if something is a number or not. So if is not a number x or is not a number y, then I'm going to return res.send x and y must be a number. And I'll send that. So if I refresh this again, and I give it a proper method, x and y must be a number. Right now I'm not including anything, so that's pretty good. So and x equals 5. That's still not right because we need to also include y. So and y equals 5. So true. So now we're getting somewhere. Now we're making sure that x and y are a number and our method is valid. So we've done pretty much every checking that we can do for the error paths. There's not really a whole lot else. So now I'm going to check if method equals add. And I'm going to return res.send, and I'm going to use the backticks again. So I'll say x plus y equals, and then because I'm using string interpolation, any valid JavaScript in here can be done, so I can just do x plus y. So now I've set up my add method. So I can do x and y equals x plus y. So if I refresh, we now get 5 plus 5 is 10. If I were to change y to being 10, it's now 5 plus 10 is 15. And the example that we gave is x equals 16 and y equals 4, which equals 20. Now if I do any other method, obviously this is not working because we haven't set it up. So we can continue our if statement. I'll just do divide, and that'll be the last one that I do. So if method equals divide, else if method equals divide, and I'm just going to do that. So now I'm just returning res.send x divided by y equals x divided by y. And if I refresh this now, 16 divided by 4 is 4. If I did x10 and y equals 2, it equals 5. If I did y is 5, then that equals 2. And this will work for pretty much anything. If I do like a weird decimal, or that's not a weird decimal. If I do y equals 3, we get like a repeating number. That's totally fine. I don't really expect like, I mean, I'm just going to be testing on integers, and if integers aren't working, then obviously we have a problem. But, so if method, and right now at the end, we're just always returning true, because at this point we would have already returned false. There are other ways that we can go about writing this code that makes it less repetitive, but I will let that be up to you to possibly figure out an alternative way of it. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Does anyone have any questions about Lab 2? Once more, now that I've been kind of showing how it works. Sorry? Yes, I was actually just about to do that. Just making sure that there was no other questions. Does anyone have any questions not regarding the cloud? Okay. So this is now the part where I promise this is really easy. So I'm going to create my repository. Oh, I guess I have to put it online. I'm going to do it as a private repository. So git commit init. Oh, touch git ignore echo node modules into .gitignore. believe that worked. Yeah. Git status. There we go. So commit init. Sorry, this is just regular GitHub stuff. Hub create lab2 test private. And it's not private. Oh wait, yeah it is. I can see it right here. It's private. Okay. So git push, which is going to give me the command of this. Git push that up. So okay. So my code is here, and this is the importance now of having our package JSON. When I go to deploy this to Heroku, this needs to now be able to download our Express dependency in order to run our application. So if I go to Heroku, and this is, I beg you to please use Heroku for this class. I've had people use Azure, and it never works out very well because Azure, I'll be honest, it pretty much sucks for anything node related. So if you log in, create your account with Heroku, you can create as many free things as you want. As you can see, I've created a bunch here. So I'm going to create a new app. So I'm going to call it lab2-comp2068-f2019. So I'm going to create the app. It's pretty quick. I go to GitHub. I connect it. So I look for lab2, which is this lab2 test. I click connect. Okay, it's now connected. I can do a couple things. I can enable automatic deployments, which means anytime that I push code into my repository, it will automatically recognize that and then redeploy it. So I can just click that. Now here's the thing. I am not pushing anything up now. I've already pushed up all my code. So this will only detect new changes. So if I want to do it manually, there's right here, manual deploy, deploy branch. So you'll see that it is now installing the dependencies, installing node modules from package.json and package lock. Goes through. It's going to prune any development dependencies, build successful, compress, done, launch, loading output, and now I can click view. And the first time that you load a website from Heroku, it needs to like spin up. It's kind of slow. This is to be expected, so don't worry if your site you think might be broken. This is just one of the negatives of being on the free tier with Heroku, is that, you know, it takes a little bit sometimes. Come on. Unless if I made a mistake, which could, oh. Let's see. So more view logs. No, it started node on server. State change from starting to crashed. Start app. Oh, I think I need to change my main to just saying server. Okay, so here's a good example of me pushing new code up. So edit package JSON, push up. So now if I go back, whoops. If I go back to overview, I can see that my new build process is now starting again. Let me just make sure that should be right. Express and NodeMon, the only thing I need is Node. Done, launching, deployed to Heroku. refresh this one more time. I think it might just be this app.use. Res.status 404.end. All right. I think I know what that part was. Let's see if it fixes on this deploy. If not, I will send out a message letting you guys know why it wasn't working. This is usually why it's a good idea to always use Express Generator, at least for most things with Node, just because it will create an error-free application off at the beginning. Otherwise, it's up to you to kind of like destroy your application. So let's see. Swear this should be working. It's using Start App. Why is it doing Start App? All right, well, it's not important. I'm not going to keep you guys as I try to fix this. Obviously, because Heroku is an optional thing for the class. But yeah, if anyone figures out why before I end up posting it, feel free to just shoot a message into Slack. That's kind of what it's there for, is to be able to share stuff with other students. So I will fix this and post the YouTube video so that way anyone watching this can do so. Like I said, it'll probably either be tomorrow or Wednesday, just because it can sometimes take a little bit just to get to it. So yeah, with that, I will see you guys next week. Please submit Lab 2 by end of day Sunday.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good night.